Hi, everybody. I am so sorry for the technical difficulties. We had a lot of trouble getting onto YouTube today. So I am really sorry about that. And I hope that we didn't lose a bunch of people. So I'm just going to go ahead and give everyone a little bit of time to get to us. I'm honestly not really sure what the glitch was, but whatever. We're here now, and that's kind of all that matters. So anyway, because we're 10 minutes late, again, I apologize. I hate being late. I expect that we're going to have some late arrivals because I was late. So anyway, please feel free, to post your questions in the chat. I'm happy to answer any questions that you may have. And I know that there were a bunch of people who were planning on tuning in tonight. If you've come with your questions, I would be happy to answer them. Just to introduce myself, I am Dr. Jessica Friedman. I am an emergency physician. I am also a former faculty member at the Icahn School of Medicine at Mount Sinai, where I was on the medical school admissions committee, as well as a member of the emergency medicine residency administration. I taught classes there. I taught medical students, residents, and I started MedEdits 2007, 2008, and I have been doing this ever since, just because I really loved what I did at Mount Sinai. I didn't want to leave that behind. And, MedEdits has grown, and I am so fortunate to have an incredible faculty on MedEdits, and we continue to grow and continue to bring on outstanding people from medical schools across the country. And, so we really have a very diverse group of people. And all of our advisors have medical school admissions committee experience or residency admissions experience, depending on what you will be applying for. So we certainly have the background and expertise to be able to guide you. So anyway, so I'm just going to jump in and start answering some questions. This has, continued to be an exciting time. We're working with students who are applying this coming cycle. AMCAS is opening next week, and so that's super exciting. We are also continuing to hear from our students who are getting into medical schools off of waitlist, and so it's definitely an exciting time. So let's just go ahead. I previously attended a medical school and they lost accreditation. Should I talk about this in my personal statement? Sarah, that is a really good question. It really depends on what your story is, when the school lost accreditation, what you've been doing since the school lost accreditation. That is, an unusual situation. And we would want to know specifically what school that was, and what were the circumstances surrounding that loss. Obviously, if this is a well-known thing, the medical schools to which you are applying are going to understand this, but the school losing accreditation, I would think would be a pretty significant part of your story, because it also is going to represent a break in your timeline. And whenever there are breaks in a timeline, or gaps in experience, that's super important to explain whatever the phase of life, right? So I would think that would definitely need to be mentioned in your personal statement, just as part of kind of your overall narrative and your overall story, but I wouldn't spend too much time on it, obviously. We would want to know, what year you were when the school lost accreditation, what you've been doing, so we could discuss things like letters of recommendation and all of that, what should be coming from the medical school. Okay, so let me just go with Jason. When does the most amount of movement occur on a waitlist for DO programs? Does the location of the medical school you attend help in the residency match? Okay, this is a wonderful question. So waitlist movement honestly can happen at any time. And it isn't as if it happens more so for one type of school, MD versus DO, at any specific time. Generally speaking, the more competitive the medical school, the less movement there is on the wait list. And why is that? It's because the more competitive schools have the highest yield. So they know that, for example, if they admit, 100 students for their class of 70, they know historically, that, let's say, they know that of those 100 admitted, 60 are going to choose to attend. So schools will admit the number of students that, based on their historical yield. Okay, so I wouldn't say there's a specific time that waitlists move, right? So this is the domino effect. One student who is admitted to a school gets off a waitlist at another school, they give up their spot, and it just keeps going. So that's kind of how that works. In terms of where you go to medical school and does that help with regards to residency, where you match for residency, I would say that it definitely is easier to match into a residency program that is in the same geographic area as your medical school. And, if you look at medical school wait lists, if you look at medical school match lists, you will see that at every medical school, a large percentage of students will be staying at that home medical school. And that is simply because that is often the easiest thing to do. Students know the faculty and they know the attendings and they know the departments at their own medical school. And they also know the hospitals, and maybe they've rotated through the hospitals at, other programs that are close geographically to the medical school. So certainly we have students who, go to medical school, let's say in New York, and want to go back to California. Does that take a little bit more effort? Absolutely, especially depending on the specialty you are pursuing, right? So the most competitive specialties, away rotations, away electives, become very important. So if you are going to medical school, using the same example in New York, you want to, let's say, do, otolaryngology, you're going to want to be doing some away rotations in California. This is also going to become interesting, as the USMLE, the United States Medical Licensing Exam, which you take at the end of your second year. That test is going to become pass-fail in 2022. So that is certainly going to shift the priorities of what's important as a medical student. So those away rotations, those letters of recommendation, those personal, connections and relationships, that you have with people at certain institutions, that's all going to become more important. Okay. So if you've applied previously, can you use the same personal statement? We usually do not recommend this. There are a couple reasons why we don't recommend this. First of all, if you didn't get in the previous cycle, there's usually a reason why you didn't get in. And oftentimes we find that the personal statement maybe could use some improvement. I realize, Sarah, your situation is a little bit different because you did get in and the school lost accreditation, but you also want to account for what you've been doing for that time period, between when you applied the first time and when you applied the second time. We usually recommend, not necessarily starting completely over, but certainly reworking the personal statement. And sometimes, when you take a personal statement, you say, okay, I'm just going to change it up a little bit. And you kind of start with a previous draft and you sort of try to add stuff in. It isn't as kind of organic and fluid as if you just kind of started from scratch. So you also have to kind of be careful with, sort of piecing something together. So just kind of be warned of that. So it was a Caribbean school that lost accreditation. Caribbean medical schools, it's becoming tougher and tougher to match into U.S. residencies from Caribbean medical schools. So we would definitely want to talk to you about what Caribbean school that was and look at your stats and figure out where you're competitive for. And we're also hearing that Caribbean medical schools are giving very, very generous scholarships to students. And so I'm not really sure what's going on in the Caribbean, in other words. These are the top Caribbean medical schools that, did not give that type of money to students. So it's making me think that things are becoming a little less competitive in the Caribbean. So we would really want to talk this through. Which month should I look into reapplying if not accepted off the wait list? Waitlisted at 2 schools. All right, so Jason, you want to you want to be reapplying now if you're waitlisted at 2 schools, assuming that you don't need to improve your candidacy, right? If you are waitlisted at 2 schools, that means you got at least 2 interviews. And that means you're a great applicant, right? Because getting 2 medical school interviews is impressive and not easy. And this is why we have our students apply, to a large number of schools and a range of schools. But if you are looking to, start medical school, if you don't get off of a wait list this cycle, you want to be submitting an application within the next, few weeks for reapplication. However, we would want to look at, well, what did the previous application look like? What were the deficiencies? Was this an issue of, interview preparation or interview performance? When we hear about students who are getting multiple interviews and those interviews are not converting to acceptances, but they're converting instead to waitlists or rejections, and I'm talking multiple interviews, not just 1 or 2, then we start to worry, well, how are you being perceived during the interview? That then becomes a big issue, because clearly if you're getting multiple interviews, your written application, your transcript, your letters of recommendation, all of that is strong enough to earn you those interviews. So something's happening in the interview space that's concerning to us. Oh, this is a great question that Spencer has. What are the practical difference between getting an MD and a DO? And we do have an article, about this on the website, and we will link to that. So the practical differences, first of all, as a DO, there is a much greater emphasis on holistic practice, on preventive healthcare, okay? You also, as a DO, will have 200 hours of training or education about manipulative therapy, which is sort of one of the hallmarks of an osteopathic education. Other than that, there are not tremendous differences. The differences really come into play once you've graduated from medical school. So as an osteopathic student, most osteopathic graduates are going into primary care specialties. They're not specializing as much as your allopathic counterparts. That said, I can tell you that I know osteopathic physicians in every specialty, in both an academic setting as well as in a community setting. I have worked alongside osteopathic physicians. Once you're actually practicing medicine, there really is zero practical difference. Many, I'd say the majority of osteopathic physicians do not use manipulative therapy. So, they're really, in the practical sense, there's not much difference, but in terms of the opportunities that are going to be available to you after graduation, I would say that allopathic physicians probably have greater opportunities, but this is not a downside for a lot of students, okay? There is a single accreditation process for residencies now, both osteopathic and allopathic. However, that doesn't mean it's, quote, easier for osteopathic students to match into allopathic residency programs. Programs that are traditionally allopathic will remain traditionally allopathic, and the same thing with osteopathic residencies. You also have to keep in mind that there are 2 certification exams. One that, the United States Medical Licensing Exam, which all allopathic medical students take, but also the COMLEX exam, which only osteopathic students take. And traditionally allopathic programs are not going to, favor the COMLEX. So a lot of osteopathic students have to make the decision, do I want to take both exams or do I only want to take one exam, realizing that only taking the COMLEX exam is going to, limit your options in terms of which residency programs you apply to. And I realize that that is super complicated and a lot of information in a short period of time, but it is a complex process. So these are all things that you need to think about when you're making the decision of whether or not, you want to apply to both MD or osteopathic medical schools. What are you competitive for? Are you going to apply to both types of medical schools the first time you apply, or are you going to first try for allopathic schools? And then the second time you apply in a reapplication, you then add on osteopathic medical school. So these are all kind of decisions that we make with our students when we work with them. And they're pretty common, situations for students. What are your thoughts about applying to MD schools that have over 10,000 applicants? What are my thoughts on that? A lot of the sort of least competitive schools, so the schools that, have the lowest MCAT, average MCATs, average, GPAs, have the largest number of applicants, okay? So in some ways, those schools end up being, based on the data alone, end up being the most competitive, right? Because their acceptance rates are very, very low, right? So schools that tend to have 10,000 applicants or even more than that, especially if they're schools that are not the most competitive medical schools in the country, they are not going to be interviewing everybody, right? So when they see a student, for example, who comes to them, let's say the school has an average MCAT of 511 and, an average, BCPM GPA of 3.73 or something. When they see a student coming to them who has a 525 and a 3.95, they might not grant that student an interview, right? Simply because they're going to say, okay, we don't expect that student would want to come to our medical school. They're going to have other options. So this is why sometimes, very competitive top tier applicants are surprised by some of, the admissions decisions that medical schools make. They say, I would have thought I would have gotten an interview at that school because my stats are way higher. And that may be the very reason they're not getting an interview, right? The exception, of course, are state schools, because state schools understand that students, who are from that state, regardless of what their stats are, they might opt to go to their state school simply because, financially, there's huge benefit, obviously, going to your state school, depending on what state you're from. You can, save, a lot of money that way. So if there are any other questions, okay, let me see. If I want to apply this cycle, when is the latest I can take my MCAT? I took it for the first time on May 1st. I am not confident about that score, though. I'm applying primarily to TMD, SAS, and DO. Okay, all right, Sanjana, that's great information. So I would want to know, okay, so if you took the exam May 1st, the issue with turning around and taking the exam very, very quickly, again, is that students rarely bump a score on the MCAT if they turn around that quickly and they take the test again. So unless there was a real reason why you might have underperformed on May 1st, we would probably advise you to do a bit of a deeper dive in figuring out what you need to do to improve your score, okay? In the ideal world, the latest test date that we like to see for applicants applying in any cycle is the mid-June or the third week of June test. So I think it's June 18th and 19th this year, simply because those scores then arrive in admissions offices, a month later, and that does not delay your application, right? Because the earliest that applications will be processed is going to be, the end of May, the end of June. Secondary essays usually aren't, sent out. Secondary applications are not usually sent out until July. So really things, heavy application review does not start in admissions offices really until the end of July. So we would really want to know, well, what was that May 1st exam result? And, how much do you need to bump to be competitive for Texas medical schools? I'm assuming you're a Texas resident. It's a great state to be from, and for osteopathic schools. So we would want to know what was the MCAT And, where does that put you in terms of your level of competitiveness for those schools? And then you'd want to be making that decision, in early June. And, if you're going to retake, unless there again are some really extenuating circumstances on that exam date, I think our inclination would be to advise you to wait. But of course, we would need to know more specifics. How has COVID changed the med school application requirements process, including MCAT, volunteering, and shadowing expectations? Rochelle, this is a terrific question. Last year was sort of the COVID, I'd say the year that was the most affected by COVID. This year, honestly, I don't think things are going to be that different. In terms of MCAT, requirements, there only are a couple schools. I think Washington is one of them, that are not requiring the MCAT this year. Otherwise, all medical schools are requiring the MCAT. They're not allowing you to take it later as they did last year. In terms of, experiences, of course, the medical schools realize that this cohort of applicants has been stuck inside, for a large part of, of the past year and a half, and they recognize that. So they understand that students' experiences are going to look a little different than they probably have, in past years. Shadowing in general, whether that's in-person shadowing or, virtual shadowing, of which there are many, opportunities now, has become honestly less important than it has in the past. Certainly medical schools want to know that you've had exposure to different specialties in medicine in different clinical settings, but medical schools really want more hands-on experience now. And, so collecting, hundreds of hours of shadowing is not something that we generally recommend. We recommend getting enough shadowing so you understand what the practice of medicine is like, again, across specialties and across settings. But we don't want you just collecting. And this is also why gap years have become, a bit more, desired by the medical schools, simply because they really want students now who've had real hands-on experience. That's why EMT work, scribing, from the medical sort of experience standpoint has become so valuable. Certainly, community service is always important to medical schools, but community service can come in many, many forms. And, students were super creative in terms of figuring out during COVID, how can I make a contribution? Does some of those experiences become a little cliche and a little ubiquitous? Of course they do. I mean, everybody is tutoring now. There are certain things that, sort of, if you feel like the whole world are, is participating in these activities. But it's still important to have community service. Obviously, the greater the impact you can make and the deeper the involvement, the more impressive the activity. But medical schools are still expecting to see community service, medical exposure / shadowing, a good MCAT performance, research, these things, these expectations have not changed. Okay, hold on. Okay, if my home institution does not offer clinical research opportunities in my intended specialty, what would you advise students to do? So Jason, I'd want to know, are you talking about your medical school? No, you're talking about your undergraduate institution, I believe. So at this stage, you don't really need to have a clinical interest, okay? At the pre-medical stage, it's about exploration. There also are a lot of remote research opportunities that exist now too. So, I think students can really get creative in terms of, reaching out to other institutions, where maybe someone is doing research in your area of interest and, asking if there's a way to be involved. Obviously, the more involved you are, the more, literature review, data collection, data analysis, the more sort of independent the research, the more impressive it is. But I would encourage you that if it doesn't exist at your home institution, what you want to do, then go find that opportunity somewhere else. Do you anticipate this cycle will be more or less competitive than last cycle? I don't think things are changing that much, honestly. I think last cycle there, because the numbers bumped largely because there were a bunch of students who decided not to take gap years and people's plans changed because of COVID. And so a lot of people who maybe weren't planning on applying kind of pivoted and decided, okay, well, I can take an MCAT in September and that's not going to hurt me this year. So even though I wasn't going to be ready, now I can be ready. So I'll just submit an application. So I think there were probably a lot of people who applied last year, frankly, who weren't really ready to apply. And I anticipate that that this year will not be any, I don't think it'll be more competitive. It'll be interesting to see. I could see applications going down ever so slightly, but we'll have to see. I don't have a crystal ball. I wish I did. Okay, will it hurt my application if I am applying with only virtual shadowing experience? I am planning on doing in-person shadowing during the summer, but that will be after I apply. That's completely fine, Spencer. Again, everybody knows that virtual shadowing became a thing in March of 2020. It's something that had never existed before. Is virtual shadowing going to be something that is going to make or break your application? No, our admissions committee is going to look at it and be like, oh my gosh, this person has 50 hours of virtual shadowing. That's fabulous. No, but it just shows, that you were trying to gain exposure. You didn't have access to in-person, experiences. And so you did your best to, kind of make do with what was available. I would be careful how you list it in the application. There are some paid services that have allowed for shadowing experiences. I think I mentioned this on my last office hours, but, Lenox Hill had a really great neurosurgery, sort of shadowing series last summer. I think they're doing it again this summer. I wouldn't be surprised if it becomes a regular thing. And that was, a great experience. So just be careful how you list these experiences. In general, experiences that you pay for or that are kind of through for-profit enterprises are not going to be as respected as those experiences that are sort of more academic in nature. Okay, what is the relative importance of shadowing, volunteering, clinical research, and clinical experiences? I have a great video, I think it's great, about extracurricular experiences that I think you should watch. And if we will post the link for that either now or after, we're done tonight. But I consider all of the things that you've mentioned to be important. Now, research does not have to be clinical. It can be basic science. It doesn't have to be either of those. What's important is that you know how to do research. Because research in any discipline, shows that you understand the research process and can be then applied to any other discipline. But certainly community service, clinical exposure to some extent. So either hands-on or hands-off is important. Hands-on clinical experience is definitely the more respected option of hands-off shadowing versus hands-on EMT, for example. The EMT work would be respected more, but does it mean that you shouldn't do any shadowing? Of course not. Shadowing is still important, and gaining any type of clinical exposure is super important, because there's no way you can know you want to be a doctor if you haven't actually, seen how a doctor practices medicine. And these trends are always changing. It used to be, 20, 30 years ago that research was the most important thing and nobody really had clinical exposure, so these trends are always changing. Right now, the trend is definitely towards hands-on clinical experience as opposed to sort of hands-off clinical experience. So I think that's an important trend to understand. Does working as a caregiver for the developmentally disabled count as clinical experience? It depends on what you were doing in that role. So were you helping people, with medications, were you helping them, maybe with, I don't know, therapy in some way, physical therapy, so it really depends. I would think that a caregiving role for developmentally disabled would count more as community service, assuming it is service and it wasn't a paid opportunity. But again, it's about how you write about these experiences. So certainly working with any patient population, you're going to learn about what their medical problems are, right? So it's also, you can do your own learning, right? Medical schools love independent learners, people who are intellectually curious. So even if you weren't sort of providing care for this population, well, what did you learn about their medical problems, about their medical care, right? Did you read about those things when you went home, even though it wasn't really a clinical experience? So it's about taking your experiences and kind of transforming them into something more, really. That's a good question. Does being a patient attendant count as clinical experience? Again, same sort of criteria apply. What did you do with that experience? How did you make it sort of more than just being a patient attendant, right? What did you observe? What did you observe about hospital operations, about teamwork, about different specialties in medicine? Did you ask physicians questions, when you were, attending to a patient? So these things can be clinical in nature. And then how you describe it, the category you give it on the application is not vitally important. We really try to encourage our students not to get, sort of too hung up on categories. It's about how you describe the experience. The reviewer is going to read the experience and they're going to understand what the different elements of that experience were. So the category you select is not, so vital. Okay. Okay. Sorry. Okay. Jason, I think I understand your question. You're referring to DO schools in terms of getting research experience. Research experience doesn't have to be specific for DO medical schools. But if you're at a DO medical school and they don't have research in your clinical area of interest, then again, go somewhere else, find it somewhere else. Especially if you're, let's say, a first year and you're going to have this summer off or something like that, try to find that experience at another institution. Where can we get hands-on clinical experience? Well, this is where gap years come into play. And certainly some of the most popular gap year experiences now are, scribing, working as an EMT, working as, an EKG tech, right? Working as an ultrasound technologist, something of that nature. Some of these things do require certification, and this is why scribing is so popular and it's such a great experience because you get such wonderful, diverse experience and they train you. A lot of students will do this for a year or two after college, and that's really a fantastic way. There are some students who work as EMTs at undergraduate institutions during college. That's another great way to get hands-on clinical experience. We've even had students who become phlebotomists, so there are all, work as pharmacy techs, so there are all different ways, that you can sort of get exposure to the medical field that counts as clinical. This is a great question, and I think it's going to be our last question from Tara. When do you think is too late to submit the primary? Is by mid-July okay? Mid-June okay? Yes, Tara, mid-June is terrific. So submitting any time in June is wonderful. So we consider any June submission, excuse me, to be an early submission. And, at that time, it's probably going to take between 4 and 6 weeks for you to get verified. If you are submitting an application, let's say the end of June, okay, the way that you gain time, this is something that I probably go over every office hours that we have, is as soon as you submit that application, you are going to start working on your secondary essays, right? So if, applications, if you're talking about MCAS, are going to be submitted to medical schools. They're processed and then they're sent to the medical schools at the end of June. So the earliest that the new secondary applications and any new secondary prompts are going to be sent out is going to be the beginning of July. So if you're submitting, let's say, the beginning of July, you then, as soon as those secondary essays and prompts are released, you're working on your secondary essays. So you're not waiting to actually get those secondary applications, you're working on them ahead of time. So then once you are verified and you get the secondary applications, most of which are sent by the medical schools automatically, you're just turning that around, right, immediately. So that's how you end up actually buying time and beating a lot of the people, who submitted on May 27th. And this is one of the reasons, when we get students who call us, the beginning of June, and they want to work with us, and they say, oh my gosh, I'm too late, I'm never getting in. And we say, no, well, if you follow this timeline and, you take this strategy, you're actually going to be earlier than a lot of the students who submitted at the end of May. So that's super important. So I want to thank everyone for tuning in. I will be back again next week. I will hopefully, be on exactly at 7. And again, I apologize. I thank you all for your patience. I hope everybody has a good night, and we will see you again next week. If you have any questions you want to send in advance, please do so at info@mededits.com and just put in the subject line, office hours questions. And feel free to visit our website, www.mededits.com. You can also sign up for a free 15-minute consultation there. And we would be happy, to work with you if you're applying to medical school this year, or if you're applying to residency, or if you're not applying for, the next couple of years. We certainly start working with students, years before they actually are ready to apply. So have a great night, and thank you so much for tuning in.